Hello, Saints. More about my trip to the Northeast during our Adventist Heritage Tour. We stopped at the Miller Farm, right outside Whitehall, there in Lowhampton, right near the Vermont border. And there we saw the house, the classic Miller house that one sees, and went inside, went into the study where William Miller had his eventful Saturday morning event where God tells him, tell it to the world. And then he makes that deal with God that he finally would, because he says, look, I'm just a farmer. No one's asked me to preach before. But finally he says, I'll preach. He says, if someone asks me to preach on that particular thing, what I've been studying in Revelation and Daniel. No one's asked him before. And so when he made that deal with God, he says that everything was fine, all peace. And then about 20 minutes later, he gets a knock at the door. And it's his 16-year-old nephew from up in Dresden, about 12 miles away. He comes in and says, Father had asked me to come to you to ask if you'll preach tomorrow. His father was the deacon at the church, and the pastor was going to be away. Well, that was one, he was asked. And then he says, if you would preach on what you'd been studying in Daniel and Revelation. And that did it. Miller thought he had a clear-cut plan. No one asked him before, but now they're asking. And he doesn't say a word, gets up, walks out the back door. Little Lucy, his daughter, about 5 years old, follows him. She usually follows her father out to the barn, but William Miller didn't make a headway to the back of the barn. He instead made a right-hand turn, went down the hill and up into the maple grove. And she turns around and comes back in and says, something's the matter with Daddy. For about 20 minutes, William stayed there in that grove, praying and debating, arguing, you could say, with God that he's just a farmer. He's not a trained preacher. And finally, he acquiesces and says he'll do it. Francis Nichol writes in his book, Midnight Cry, the book on the Millerite movement from 1944, he says, Miller went into that maple grove, a farmer. He came out a preacher. God's called you and I to different things too. This was at the beginning of what would become the church we know today with the message that we have. Is he calling you to something that you're saying, look, I'm not the one qualified? He calls those and qualifies those whom he calls. In other words, it isn't based on your talents, on your skills, on your knowledge. It's based on what God does. And if you're willing, he'll fit you for whatever he calls you for. William Miller learned that the hard way, but he did acquiesce, he did obey, and God used him in a very mighty way. He can use you too, right now at this time in salvation history, as we prepare to go home. Blessings.